something that you're interested in pursuing, if you're interested in advancing your career, maybe you had your license before and it didn't quite work out. You didn't have the right guidance, you didn't have the right situation, you weren't at the right firm for you. It's okay to start over. It's okay to start again. Even if you've lost your real estate license and you maybe see the interest rates dropping and the real estate market picking up again, that you're interested in reactivating your real estate license. But the main thing is, again, finding out about these opportunities. So dress to impress. Come to the career fair ready to impress these recruiters at these firms, even if you are brand new. You know, this event is a very safe space. I don't even like using words like that, but it really is, because if you're new and you don't really know about real estate, this is the perfect place to come to ask those questions, because this is...
You are watching Ask the Instructor. Absorb the knowledge. Become the expert.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Ask the Instructor. My name is John Chrismo, and this show is brought to you by the Tampa School of Real Estate. We're here every single Wednesday live to help you understand the technical side of the real estate industry. And what we're talking about today is math you should know. Today, we're going to be breaking down exactly how to solve income capitalization. Now, not only is this one of the most popular questions on the Florida real estate exam, this is also essential to understanding the value of cash flowing investment properties. So even after you pass your exam, this is math that you absolutely want to know if you're going to be working with investors. So let's head over to the board and get right into solving this here. Now, my one precursor to this is, especially for studying for your exam, what we're going to be breaking this down is completely start to finish of this process. And on your exam, you're not likely to have a question that's going to be this long to complete. However, you're going to have some portion of this process as your question. What portion that is exactly, well, that depends on which random question you get. And that's why it's going to be super essential to not just know the numbers, the calculations we're going to be doing here, but more importantly, knowing what those numbers are also called. Because number one, that's going to help you remember this process, because it's going to give more meaning to each of these steps. But number two, when they tell you that potential gross income is this and effective gross income is that, you'll know what that means, and you'll know that they've already done one step for you if they've directly given you the effective gross income. Or they've done extra steps even for you if they directly give you the net operating income. So we're going to make sense out of all of this here, as well as how this relates to a specific property. So let's begin. We're going to simplify this down to a potential exam question. We're going to get simpler and simpler as the video goes on, so stick around here. But this is the most descriptive of everything going on, and where income capitalization, what it is. So first and foremost, what is income capitalization? As I mentioned, it's the value from an investment property, from a rental perspective, an income producing, cash flowing type of perspective. We're trying to figure out what is the value of the property based off of the income that it generates. And there's a very specific way to do this, because this is a very standardized calculation. If you actually are going to be renting out or selling rental properties, there's calculations in the MLS where you fill in net operating income, effective gross income, potential gross income. So these terms, again, important for your exam, but also important for the real world. And in order to establish the value, it's not necessarily just based on the comps of what other properties have sold for. It may be based on the comps of other rent if the property is vacant and you don't have rent for it. But if this is an income producing property, especially if we're talking about more than 5 units, this is even how the banks value the property, is using this approach as opposed to based on sales of other properties. So it's a very important approach to value to understand in the investment space, especially in commercial real estate, and again, when you're dealing with 5 units and more. Now, in order to understand that value, we need to understand the rental income. And we're going to be doing an example today involving a 4-unit property. So 4 units, and let's say that each of these units could rent out for $1,000 a month. So $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 per month. So each of these 4 units, $1,000 per month, $4,000 total. Now, one of the assumptions is that rent is always a monthly number, because when you talk about rent, such as $1,000, you're saying $1,000 per month because it's typically paid on a monthly basis. And so because this is a monthly number, we have to remember that that is monthly, whereas income, on the other hand, when we're talking about income, it's always assumed to be annual, unless it specifies otherwise. Income is an annual number, whereas rent is a monthly number. And therein lies our first additional step in a question if this were something on your exam. And there could be a question as easy as this on your exam. What could it be based on this scenario? There's a 4-unit property where each of the units rent for $1,000 per month. What is the potential gross income of this property? So that's PGI for short, but on your exam, they're usually not short. So it'll usually say potential gross income, maybe potential income. That would essentially mean the same thing, but gross is going to mean before expenses. So we're not even worried about any expenses at this point. We're just dealing with the total amount of income generated. So if this were a question on the exam, $4,000 would be an incorrect answer, because $4,000 is the monthly potential rent, not the monthly, or the annual, I should say, income, because rent is monthly, income is annual. See, it tripped me up even just explaining it right there, because income has to be annual. So what we've got to do now is multiply this by 12. We take 4,000, and you're allowed to use a calculator on your exam. 4,000 times 12, you're going to get $48,000. Simple as that. The calculations you actually have to do for the exam are that. And you could probably do this calculation without a calculator, but you're already going to be racking your brain enough on the exam. No need to add the extra stress of having to do this math manually. So that's why you could use a calculator very similar to this one on the exam. And if this were the question, what is the potential gross income? That would be your answer. And that's really step 1 in the series of steps of coming up with the value of a property using the income capitalization approach. Is number 1, establishing the potential gross income. And this is going to be most important if this is a vacant property, especially if this is what's called pro forma, meaning it's an estimate based on industry comps, other comps in the area, but it's not real numbers. Ideally, in the real world, if you have real numbers, you could calculate this all the way down to the actual, and the only time this is really important in the real world is for understanding what is the real growth potential. Before we even factor in what anything costs, what is the most if we maxed out the rent? Because maybe part of the investment strategy is going to involve improving the property so these rents can be raised. And that's where looking at, okay, what is the potential for the entire property? What could it produce if you improve the property? Not only could you potentially increase rents, but also potentially decrease turnover. Because if it's a more enjoyable place to live, people will stay there longer. And so by reducing the turnover, you're reducing what's called vacancy and collection losses. So I'm going to put another diagram up here. And this upside down pyramid, triangle, funnel, however you want to think of it, what we just calculated out is your potential gross income. But that is fairy tale land because it's not what the property actually generates, it's what it could, which is great to have a dream, but we also have to factor in a little bit of reality, that is the vacancy and collection losses. The vacancy and collection losses bring you down to your effective gross income. So to go from potential gross to effective gross, you're simply subtracting out the vacancy and collection losses. And that would be the time, going back to this example here, where one of these units is vacant because maybe one of the tenants do leave, or you have to evict them, or whatever it is, and you have lost rent for a month, 2 months, 3 months even. Who knows if it's taking longer to rent the property. That could be another reason behind improving the property, because not only will you have lower turnover, but you'll also have less time that the property sits vacant. And this is behind many investment strategies to where investors buy a cash flowing property that is already producing income, but on top of that, they can improve the cash flow and therefore improve the value of the property, because the name of the game in this and what ultimately determines the value is the net operating income. And to get to the net operating income, so we talked about potential gross income. This is how much a property could generate. Effective gross is how much it actually brings in when you subtract out the money that you do not collect from vacancy and collection losses. But you still have what's known as operating expenses. And operating expenses are how you progress down to the final stage of income, which is net operating income. So I know a lot of you are watching this for exam review, so the best part for exam review is when we do this as simply as we possibly can. The simpler it is, the easier it is to remember. So let me try to say this and explain this whole flow one more time as simply as possible. So if you want to go back and listen to this soundbite over and over and over again, it'll probably help you for your exam. Potential gross income is how much a property could generate. But then you subtract vacancy and collection losses to get how much it effectively or actually grosses before expenses. And before what type of expenses? Operating expenses. Because net operating income is not operating expenses. So to get to net operating income, we have to subtract out those operating expenses. And this is the final level of income, at least for the income approach. You do also have to factor in beyond this on an individual basis, business expenses. So as an individual investor, this isn't your bottom line number of how much you're taking home. Your business is still going to have expenses, including, most importantly, to separate this out, any financing expenses. So if your investment business does not have the capital to invest in this real estate, that's fine. Most real estate is purchased with leveraged capital, meaning you're borrowing money, but those borrowing costs, aka a mortgage payment, which is very confusing on the exam if they slip in the word about mortgage payment in this here, but that mortgage payment is not applicable when it comes to operating expenses, nor would be any personal taxes or income taxes, because income taxes are going to change based on who is earning that income. Property taxes, on the other hand, are included because property taxes are considered a normal operating expense of the property. So it is important to also understand those different expenses on your exam. They could throw that in there. I've seen it before where they've thrown in mortgage information. So very important that you do not take the bait on that mortgage information. Mortgage would not be considered an operating expense. That's a business expense, which is not factored in here because remember, we're trying to make a standardized calculation that we as the listing agent could advertise. Because as the listing agent of this 4-unit property here, I could advertise that it's got a potential gross income of $48,000 a year. We could estimate vacancy and collection losses, and so let's do that. Let's estimate vacancy and collection losses at 10%. So our $48,000 here, we're going to subtract 4,800, which is 10%. And when we take 48,000 and we subtract 4,800, that gives us 43,200. And that is what the property actually would generate if 10% of the money is lost due to vacancy and collection losses. On your exam, it is that simple where they give you this percentage here. And in the real world, you could always calculate that percentage by taking those losses and then dividing it out from the potential gross income to determine what percentage of that is lost, which is very good for understanding, again, where the investment is trending, because you ultimately want to reduce this. Why would you want to reduce this? Well, because if you reduce this, that means more income. And I'm going to foreshadow what we're going to cover here in a little bit about net operating income. But more income equals more value here. If everything else stays the same, anything we could do to create more income is going to increase the value of the property. And this is where a term known as forced appreciation comes into play. Because as the property owner of this investment, you could force the appreciation, and you do that by being able to raise the rent. Now, how are you able to raise the rent while not reducing your vacancy and collection losses? Typically, you have to improve the property, improving the management, improving the condition, improving appliances, improving common areas, improving the pool, improving whatever aspects that will make people pay more money for this property. And when you do that, and you could earn higher money in rent, that's automatically, if everything else stays the same, going to increase the income. But you don't even necessarily have to charge more rent right off the bat, because you might be able to reduce vacancy and collection losses simply just by improving the management of the property. Same thing with the operating expenses. If you could reduce the amount of expenses, not much you could really do about the property taxes, but maintenance cost, other expenses that are involved with operating the property, maybe getting a better deal on the insurance for the property, whatever it may be. Those could all reduce the operating expense, which is going to increase the net operating income. Because let's say this property took $20,000 a year. Remember, we're dealing in annual numbers here. So very important that you remember this is a year, this is a year, this is a year. Don't change up month to year, because that's how the exam might give you the information. They might give it to you as a month, but you need it as a year. So pay attention to that. And best tip I have for you for practicing these is repetition. Even if you're practicing this exact same example here, especially if you're remembering what these numbers are called, you're going to be set for the exam. Yes, the numbers are going to be different, but if you could remember these steps and you could understand where they're plugging you in at this process here, you could solve this. You could do this. And these are some of the easiest, most predictable questions on the exam when you've practiced these steps. So we need to subtract our $20,000 here. That's our operating expenses per year, because again, we're trying to go from the effective gross income to the net operating income. And so when we subtract that out, again, you could use your calculator. But I'm going to trust myself here, the risk of public humiliation. And on your exam, you don't have to show off that you can do math without a calculator. You could use a calculator just like this on your exam. Basic for function, but it's really all you need, because these calculations, this is really as complex as it gets. It's not complex calculations. It's just knowing what to do with these numbers, knowing the meaning behind these numbers. And the more you understand it, the more it makes sense, the easier it is to remember. But what we have just figured out, and this could be a question in and of itself, where it could give you some variation, some version of what we've been talking about so far. Could be going all the way back to the monthly rent, where you've got to figure out the total monthly rent across all the units and then multiply that by 12 to get the annual number, and then subtract out the vacancy and collection losses, and then subtract out the operating expenses. And operating expenses, as well as vacancy and collection losses, really everything I've given to you on this side right here, this would be given to you in the question. And in the real world, you would simply look at what those expenses are, add them all up, as well as looking at what percentage of you might have a property that's rented 100% of the time. Now, as an investor that's looking to force appreciation, if you've already got 0% vacancy and collection losses, there's not really any appreciation you could force there. So it might not be as much of a deal because it's not much of an opportunity. And that's why a lot of times you see properties that are investment properties that are for sale, where you'll notice that there's corners that have been cut, it seems like, or things that should have been done that weren't done. And sometimes that's intentional because someone doesn't want to over-improve the property. Because if they over-improve it, they leave no room for the next investor to be able to further improve that property. If you max out what that property could ultimately be, there's no further room for improvement. So that now is no longer an opportunity for investors who like to force appreciation by improving the property. Flipping, as it's known in the world of where you're just turning around and flipping the property later based just solely on the improvements. And you could do that while earning rent. This is done at a large scale just by, again, being able to manipulate these numbers. Now, you can't always just increase the rent to what you do want to increase it to, because you could. You're the landlord. Unless there's some rent control, you could basically make the rent whatever it is that you want. But then this number might creep higher. Because if there's not the demand for ultimately what you do want to charge, and there's other supply, there's other properties out there, you're going to see this number increase. That vacancy and collection loss. And so that's why this is extremely valuable when this property already has a track record with this data. And again, maybe, so let's say there's 4 units here, and one of these units weren't rented for 2 months. Because maybe somebody left, and then we got a new tenant in 2 months later. They're renting for, technically, we had budgeted here. If this was our budget, we had budgeted for almost 5 months worth of rent for a single unit. And if we only had 1 unit that didn't rent, we're actually making money right there just because, again, maybe we've been good to our tenants. We've been taking care of them, making sure their problems are fixed, and so they don't want to leave. You do that, that will reduce your vacancy and collection loss. But again, when you already see a low number here, no opportunity for a future investor. So let's move on. We could explain this and dive deep and really do a whole masterclass on really going everything on what this means and implementing it in rental property sense, because this can be very lucrative for, again, being able to force appreciation. But knowing this math is the key to unlocking this idea of forced appreciation. Because it's not just based on what somebody would pay because you painted it a different color. It's based on what people are actually paying. And so you have hard numbers to actually back up whatever you're asking for the property. Now, we haven't gotten to that actual value yet. And that's going to be really the end of the line when it comes to this type of question of what this could be maximum start to finish here. Now, likely what we just did would be a question in and of itself, going from potential gross income down to net operating income. Because what we're about to do, they would likely have already given you this information right here. Because there is a certain limit of how long they want the questions to be on the exam in terms of how long it takes you to solve them. So they're extremely unlikely you're going to get a question that is asking you to do everything we've just done, start to finish, and what we're about to do to get to the value of this property. Now, they could start you right there, where all you have to know is that was the net operating income. So you have to recognize that term, because they might also tell you on there what operating expenses are, and telling you that those operating expenses are $20,000. But why would you need to know the operating expenses if they've already given you the final end of the line number? And that's what you need to be able to know, so the exam doesn't outsmart you, but you outsmart the exam. You can see right through their tricks if you know the names of these numbers and you know what they mean. Whereas if you're just looking at the numbers and you forgot that this is already in there, you're going to try to now subtract that, and you're going to say, oh, well, the income is only $3,200 here. But that's not the case because we already subtracted this from the $43,200. They might not just tell you any of that information up there because, again, they might be plugging you in to the steps we're doing right here. And now the next steps are going to involve what's known as the IRV triangle. See that? IRV. We're going to come back to the rest of this hourglass type of design here in just a moment, but for now, let's just get a close-up on IRV. Because IRV is for income, rate, and value. Income, rate, and value. And in this case here, we're ultimately trying the value of the property. We're trying to find the value. And so when you circle what you're looking for, in this case, the value, we're trying to find the value here. What you're left with is income over rate. So this magic triangle here is the secret to remembering formulas. Value is income over rate. So to solve this question finally, and the back half of this is actually quite a bit simpler here. There's a lot more going on to get to the net operating income than there is once you get to the net operating income, because that is the type of income we need when we're doing income divided by rate. So the value we're going to calculate out here is going to be our $23,200 of income. And let's say the capitalization rate was 5%. So we're just going to plug that in our calculator here. And this would be given to you. Now, what is capitalization rate? It's the rate of return, essentially, to make it as simple as possible. But it's basically the rate of return on if this were the cash you invested and what you got out of it before we factor in any business expenses. So that's known as cap rate. And ultimately, the higher this cap rate, the better the deal it is. And I'll show you an example here in just a moment of what if this were a 10% cap rate, what would be the value of the property. So at a 5% cap rate, and again, the cap rate would be given to you in the exam question for having to solve this. This would be real simple on the exam. It would give you income in some form, some version, and just pay attention because they're likely to try to trip you up in however version it is that they're giving you income there. They're going to give you the capitalization rate, and you just have to find the value, which again, you know this triangle. You're going to remember the formula because you could lay it right out there and say, okay, we're looking for value, circle what you're looking for, what's left over, income over rate. And so 23,200 divided by 5%, that would mean the value of this property at a 5% cap rate would be $464,000. And that would be based on the 4 units that are generating. Let's go through it visually of everything we just did here. So if we had 4 units that rented for $1,000 each, that would be $4,000 a month, 12 months in the year. That's $48,000. So $48,000, that's our potential for this investment property. But we've got to factor in all these other numbers here because, yes, we did start out with that potential of $48,000, but then we have to subtract out our vacancy and collection losses right here. So these vacancy and collection losses the vacancy and collection losses represent what we do not take in. What we actually bring in is the effective gross income. We subtract out the operating expenses to get to our net operating income, which is not operating expenses, that's $23,200. We could then take that, divide it by the cap rate, because again, income divided by rate equals the value, and that's going to give you the value of $464,000. Now, as I mentioned earlier, what if this rate were 10%? So value, we'll put it in red and you should be able to see that. So value, income over rate. We've got the same income, let's say, $23,200. But let's say it was a 10% cap rate. And I said this would be a better deal, so let's do the math and find out why that'd be a better deal. So that's $23,200 divided by 0.10, and that's going to give us $232,000. So now can you tell why that's a better deal? Would you rather, as a buyer, for the same property, both situations here, nothing different, they're generating $23,200 in income, but at a 10% cap rate, you're going to pay $232,000. With a 5% cap rate, you're paying $464,000 for the same income. That's what cap rate tells you there. The cap rate, again, it's basically the rate at which you're getting income from the value of the property. So at 5%, getting 5% of this $464,000 is $23,200. But if you only paid $232,000 and you're getting that level of income, well, now you're getting 10% of a return. So if you only paid this and you're able to get that, you're in a lot better situation than somebody who paid twice as much with the same amount of income. And that's what the cap rate tells you. Now let's go through this one more time and change this up a little bit more. And let's say we did some of those things we talked about. We're going to do this calculation again, but we're going to reduce our cap rate. We're not even going to raise the rents here. We're going to reduce our cap rate, or our vacancy and collection losses, I should say. Very important not to confuse these two percentages in this here. Vacancy and collection losses is what you don't collect because of tenants not being there. Cap rate is the rate of return for your investment, essentially. So completely separate items. But if we could reduce that as the owner of this property to 5%, because again, we're better to our tenants, and let's say the last people were really mismanaging the property and we could get these costs down to $10,000 for operating expenses instead of the $20,000. So let's do the math again. This exact same math here. And I'm going to lay this all out exactly what we're going to do. This helps out a lot on the exam. Income over rate times value. We're ultimately going to find the value, and in order to do that, we're going to need the income, and we're going to specifically need the net operating income, which at this point I would look in the question and say, did the question tell us the net operating income? And they didn't. We got all that other data we've got over there, but we've got to recalculate net operating income, so we don't have that. So we will need the operating expenses, because we're going to need that to get to the net operating income, and we're going to subtract that from our effective gross income. So you want to see if that is given to you, because if it does give you the effective gross income, you would not need the vacancy and collection losses. Because if they already told you the effective gross income, the vacancy and collection losses are already factored in. But if they didn't give you the effective gross income, then you'll have to start from the top, which is what we're doing here. Now, we do have the $48,000 as our potential gross income. Let's say that's how it would give it to us in the question. It could have said the 1,000 units for 4 units, or they could have just said $48,000 for potential gross income. It means the same thing. There's just an extra step involved if it tells you $1,000 per unit. But again, the changes we're implementing now, the different things would be given here in the question. So if we get that down to 5%, if we get our operating expenses down to $10,000, number one, we're going to find out the net operating income, and then number two, we're going to capitalize it and see how the values of this property are going to differ from what we had just calculated there. So $48,000 of potential gross income, 5% of that. So we're going to take our calculator right here. It's half of 4,800, so 2,400, but on the exam, it's a high-stress environment, so don't be afraid to work out these calculations right on your calculator because your mind will play tricks on you. And I'm live on the air, so I could be making mistakes as well. So 0.05, 2,400. The mind is loyal again. So we take that 48,000, subtract the 2,400, and that's going to give us 45,600. And that's now our effective gross income, what the property is actually bringing in compared to what it could bring in when we subtract out these 5% vacancy and collection losses right here. Now we need to take out the $10,000 of operating expenses, and that's going to bring us to $35,600 of net operating income. And if you couldn't tell from the last example, that's night and day difference from 23,000. That's a huge difference from those small changes. So this would be a major overhaul of this property, because now we went from a $23,200 income to a net operating income of $35,600, and that was simply just by reducing our turnover, our vacancy and collection losses, reducing the operating expenses. Now we've got that boiled down to maybe just taxes and insurance and very little money otherwise. So pulling this off would be, again, completely transformation turnover of this property. But let's say we did pull it off here, and we've got the net operating income to $35,600. So that is our I. Let's divide it by a capitalization rate of, we'll use that same 10% here to figure out we'll go with the 5%, since that is not only more realistic, but it also is going to give us a bigger number here. So 35,600 divided by 0.05, and that's now a $712,000 property using the same 5% cap rate. So if the 5% cap rate is kind of the going rate in the market, meaning that if you had a cap rate of, let's say, only 3%, that would mean that you're charging even more for this property with the same amount of income, so it's not as attractive. And so the market kind of sets what your cap rate range would be, and again, it depends on factors of the property as well. But at a 5% cap rate, this would be how you could force the appreciation. And again, if you were able to do this without raising rent a dime, that's how much this property would be worth now. $712,000 compared to over here, when we only had $23,200 worth of income, it was worth $464,000. And again, if we had that lower cap rate, it'd be worth even, or higher cap rate, I should say, it'd be worth even less. But maybe this person bought it here when the cap rates were really good at 10%, and they didn't do anything different. They kept the rents the same, expenses the same, nothing's changed. They just simply sell for that lower cap rate because that's maybe now what the market commands, and that's now what that property could be worth. But it could go both ways, because this could easily rise as well, especially if there's more supply in the market, there's more apartments, maybe demand, there's not as many people moving to the area. Those are all things that affect this on a grander scale. But this is a really great question for your exam, and we have a very simplified review of this exact type of scenario in the exam cram workbook. Matter of fact, it's actually very exactly similar to what you've just seen right here. But the thing I will say is it has far less explanation than I'm providing here. Because if you're brand new to all this, you've never studied this at all, you need this explanation to make sense of this right here. And especially at first, the more explanation you can get, the more it kind of starts to make sense. But when it comes to studying and practicing this for the C exam, you really want repetition of the simplest version of this possible. And we've got some great exam questions in our Exam Cram workbook, as well as the question simulator, that are all available with our Pass First Try Exam Prep Bundle. You can find more details on that at passfirsttry.com. Again, that's passfirsttry.com. It has a whole strategy of step-by-step how to go through about studying for this exam and passing this exam. If not on your first attempt, if you've already taken it, on your next attempt. Because this exam is passable, but it's not going to pass itself. And there's certain things like this math. You could easily write off the 10 math questions on the exam, but these are some of the most predictable questions on the exam. You just have to get these steps down, and repetition is the key for that. So what I'd recommend with these Exam Cram videos right here is I would take that math section. You do get a print workbook that we ship out to you with that Pass First Try bundle here, and in the back you've got these math questions, but we also give you a digital copy of this right here. So what I recommend you do is print out additional copies of these math questions, and you could practice those same math questions again and again and again. Yes, you'll remember the numbers, but more importantly, you'll remember the steps to solving these questions, and you'll be prepared to be able to recreate those steps on the exam, just like we've been doing here today. But you could do this on the exam in 2 or 3 minutes. There's a lot of extra explanation that we've got going on here, but when it comes to solving this and going through it and practicing it, this is maybe 5 minutes tops when you're first kind of really learning it. But once you get this down to just a couple of minutes, boom, 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 what the steps to do, you're going to be set for these types of questions on the exam. My biggest recommendation for you, though, is making sure for this question specifically, you know these different terms and where they factor into this whole puzzle right here. Because you're not going to have something completely start to finish like we went through here, going all the way from potential growth to this. You could. In theory, you could. But most likely, it's going to be a shorter version of this where you're having to start here, or you're just getting down to net operating income. That's all they're asking you, and you're not even doing anything with capitalization rate. What question they give you, well, that's going to depend. There's several variations of this in the state exam question bank, so you want to be prepared for any combination, any way that they're formatting that right there. And the easiest way to get that down is knowing the start to finish and knowing what each of these terms are called. Because you'll know that if you've got net operating income, operating expenses are already a thing of the past, and therefore you do not need to include the operating expenses even if they're mentioned in the question. Other tips that I shared with you today, such as the mortgage payment. You never do anything with a mortgage payment when it comes to income capitalization. As an investor, sure, factor that in for your actual cash flow. But when it comes to income capitalization and what we'd put in the MLS for the listing for this right here, as well as what would be on the exam, you do not factor in mortgage financing to this whatsoever. So that is the income capitalization approach, and there are other variations on this where you could basically use the same triangle here to figure out the rate. And to do that, you circle R, and what you're left with is income divided by value. So to find out what your cap rate is, you just take the income, the net operating income, and divide it by your value of the property. So that's why, as we explained this earlier, this 5%, the $35,600, is 5% of $712,000. So that triangle helps out a lot. Again, just circle what you're looking for and solve the math for what is left. Practice this. Put it on repeat. Do as much repetition if you can. And again, if you're looking for more structured review on this right here, this workbook, very beneficial. If you have questions about that, maybe you haven't even taken the course yet to get your real estate license, that's okay. We have several online different versions. Call us up 24/7. 813-333-2676. Anytime, day or night, we're standing by to help you advance your real estate career. We've had students from over 40 countries around the world taking our online programs, our classrooms here in the Tampa Bay area, in Lakeland, in Pinellas County. Maybe you're doing a live online class. Maybe you're doing the video on demand. Maybe you're way in continuing education because you're so far ahead of this stuff, but you came here today to learn more about the investment side and this investment math because, if you don't use this, this is something you can easily forget as you progress further into your career. But maybe if you're looking to venture into investment real estate, we do have some courses on that as well that qualify for continuing education. So anyway, we'd help you. Reach out to us, 813-333-2676, as well as if you've just been stuck on your exam and you haven't been able to pass, reach out to us. We'd love to give you a personalized one-on-one support session to go through what those sections are that are causing you the problem and develop a plan to get you passing that exam. We've got some great tools here that are phenomenal resources that really simplify this down as much as possible. So questions about that, any of our programs to earn your real estate license and more, 813-333-2676. You can also visit us online at tsre.us. That's about all the time that we've got for today. So thank you all for tuning in. We will be back this Friday for State of Real Estate. Until then, have a fantastic rest of your week.
The most powerful tool to study for your real estate exam is the Question Simulator from Tampa School of Real Estate. We've used our years of experience in preparing students for the Florida real estate exam to bring you the most powerful exam study tool available. In the Question Simulator, you'll be able to go directly to a particular unit so you can focus on the sections where you need the most practice. We have also included the percentages of each unit so you know which units are the most important for your real estate exam. Every question will immediately give you detailed feedback, which is almost always more important than the question or the answer themselves. After completing all the questions in a particular unit, you can go through question by question and review any that you've gotten wrong. You could also print out a report at the end of each quiz. The Question Simulator from Tampa School of Real Estate is 100% mobile compatible, so you can practice with test questions anywhere you have your phone with you. Enroll now at questionsimulator.com and get ready to pass your exam.
Are you studying for your Florida real estate exam? If you are, you need to check out our Pass First Try strategy. You're going to love this. It's 4 steps that we break down the process to study for your Florida real estate exam. So you're set up to pass your Florida real estate exam because that's what you're studying for, right? To pass your exam. It's 4 steps. Number 1, you learn the information. You've got to learn this to be able to pass the exam, but it doesn't stop at learning. Step 2, you've got to reinforce the basic, simple, key concepts. As you learn this information, keep reviewing the simple things. You don't need to know everything, but you got to review these basic key concepts. Step 3, you've got to test your knowledge. The exam's going to test your knowledge, so if you don't test your knowledge in advance, you won't find out if you know what you think you know until you take the exam. And then step 4 is be confident and prepared, because even if you know this material, you need to be confident that you know the material. Check out the full strategy at passfirsttry.com. That's passfirsttry.com. Have you been thinking about getting your Florida real estate license? Look, the process is probably easier than you think. We break it down step by step, how much it's going to cost, what it is that you need to do to get your Florida real estate license. Find out all of that and more at licensefl.com. Again, that's licensefl.com.